Today we're going to be talking about the cardiac cycle. To start, the cardiac cycle, many ask what it is. Not many know what it is, but some may say that it's one heartbeat, which is then equal to one complete cycle of the cardiac cycle, which is full of contractions and relaxations of the heart in the process of pumping our blood and removing our blood from the heart. So what is the cardiac cycle? Well, the cardiac cycle is a sequence of events in which every heartbeat has the opportunity to have the heart fill up as well as empty blood from it. There's about 3 phases, which are called the arterial systole, ventricle systole, and the diastole. There are several steps, however, in this cardiac cycle, and one of the first being when the heart is filling up with the blood when it's relaxed. That is called diastole. Then it goes into the arteria contract while it's pushing out more and more blood into the ventricles, and this is the atrial systole. Number 3 is then led to when the ventricles contract, which then allows the mitral valve to close. Then we get into when the blood is then pumped into the aorta, and that carries into the ventricles being relaxed and allowing the aortic valve to be then closed. And that is one whole cycle of the cardiac cycle. These steps are then repeated over and over again, and this is how we get our blood in and out of our heart. This is the Wiggers diagram. It begins showing the different steps of this task being done and this cycle being done, and it starts with the aortal contractions at the beginning, which then carries all the way until the passive ventricular fillings, which is at the end of the cycle, and then this is then repeated over and over again. But in between, we have the left atrium that is releasing blood, and we have the atrial systole ends are being present, and then the isoventricular contractions and the ventricular release occurs, which then goes down, and that's when the passive ventricular fills occurs. Mitral and aortic valves. It's then started with a aortic valve closing, which then leads to the aortic valve opening, and then the aortic valve closes, and then the mitral valve then opens, and this is also repeated into the cardiac system, or the cycle of which the blood is being pumped and released out from the heart. Then we have the dicrotic notch. This notch is where the cystic gets released and the dicrotic is then present and switches the system back and forth between the two. Then we have valve closures and heart sounds. When it comes to the valve closures and heart sounds, the mitral valve closes at S1, which is towards the bottom here, and the aortic valve closes towards the top, making the second sound up there. So those two sounds are the 2 different noises that we hear when our heart is beating and when we're listening to a patient's heart. Now we move on to why the left ventricle has higher pressure. There's 2 different kinds of pressure, one being the systolic pressure, which is basically representing the time during which the left and right ventricles contract and eject blood, while on the other hand, the diastolic pressure represents the period when the ventricles are relaxed and not contracting. So these are just 2 very interchangeable pressure types, allowing the left ventricle to always have a higher pressure than the right. So overall, there were a few major points that were discussed. The cardiac cycle, in which there's many different processes that go into allowing blood to be pumped in and out of our hearts, and that is the symplectic version of the cardiac cycle. And then we have the filling and pumping of the blood, which is the number 1 occurrence in the cardiac cycle. And then on the other hand, we have the valves and opening and closing with different pressure changes, which is another huge factor into this. And then the Wigger's diagram, which was very important to pointing out different steps in the cycle. Here are my references, obviously the book, and then the left ventricle heart. This really helped with knowing like the different information on what was making the left ventricle higher in pressure than the right ventricle, allowing different physiological things to be shown in that. And then in the other one, the physiologic is the cardiac system, and this really helped with just breaking down the steps and knowing the difference between certain things and the cardiac system in general, because it was full of a lot of information. So with all of that, I would say the cardiac system really cycle is very important because that is what is allowing us to keep pumping our blood and removing it from our heart.